friends. It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And I know we've talked about this before, but I got this habit where I make a playlist every year that is named that given year, 2022 playlist. And I populate it with music that I discovered and liked that year. And it sort of becomes the soundtrack of that year. And those songs become wedded to memories from that year. It's very intentional. It's an attempt to reproduce what happened when we were all younger and we all sort of ran in the same circles and had shared stories, and before we all got weirdly compartmentalized into our little subcultures, and we all, at least like, we knew some of the same songs. And so that song was like, it's the summer of 97. I remember that one. So 2018, maybe 2019, Spotify decides to serve up to me a song by a girl I'd never heard of named Ava Max. I'm like, well, okay. Sometimes you're right, Spotify. Let's give it a listen. And immediately I'm like, oh, good job, Spotify. This is the kind of like soaring girl vocal pop that I like. And yeah, it's a little predictable because most pop is right now, but it's fun. I'm entertained. And the song's called Sweet But Psycho. I don't know what that means. Like, probably just singing about a girl who's kind of got two sides to her. What I think I just don't even care. Whatever. It's a pop song. And it evoked some of the retro elements that I liked about the Carly Rae Jepsen pop of the 2000 teens and Lady Gaga in her heyday and heck, Madonna in her heyday. And again, like, I know we don't all have the same opinions on media and everything else, and some people like the different things and it's offensive, and like, just listen to whatever you're into. It's cool, whatever. We don't have to agree on any of these things. But I'm a sucker for pop and I like the song. Well, I forget about it. A little bit of time goes by and I heard something else. It's like, I've heard that name before. There was some song that she did that I liked. I went back and I found it on the interwebs. Like, that's right, it's Sweet But Psycho. And I listened to it a little bit and I was like, yeah, it's pretty cool. I still think that's catchy. And so I just did a little bit of clicking around to find out what the deal was with this gal. And wow, I walked into this firestorm about the lyrics of that pop song. And apparently it was super important to people that it mean this or that it mean that, because it's like a narrative about misogyny or ableism regarding people with psychoses, or it's some kind of narrative about how pop music has gone south and how, like, the good old days things were good, but now everything's morally corrupt and bad, and this is what liberalism does. Like, everybody had this super complicated read, and there were like essays about this song, and I'm going, I don't know, it just seemed like a cute little pop song. Somebody sang about it and they probably danced around to it and stuff. The kids probably liked it. Like, I don't think you need to read so much into it. The best read is probably the most obvious read, which is like, oh, here's a song about a girl. It's kind of got two sides to her. Like, okie dokie. It seems pretty easy. Well, this is a thing that we do, though, as people, right? Like, we look at a cultural text, that being anything that people produce and put in front of other people. And sometimes, rather than just looking at the really rather simple and obvious meaning of it, because we have all of these other big fights that we're in, or these other issues that we're invested in, now this little cultural text comes along and it's got to fit into that somehow. It's got to work with all the other things, and it can't be out of place. And we got to have like a take that fits with our view of all the other things that can be inflicted on like this little, sometimes inconsequential thing. And so because we're so invested in all of that other stuff, sometimes it makes it difficult to look at the plain and obvious read on a rather straightforward cultural text. I'm about to make a rather controversial remark, if I haven't already. I just took 4 minutes talking about Ava Max's Sweet But Psycho. And the funny thing is that if you just heard me say those words, you are literally still here. That's insane. But I'm going somewhere with this, and it's super important for what we do next in chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew. We got these 2 chapters coming up, right? After the 7 woes of chapter 23, and it's going to feel like a big pivot. If you've looked ahead in your Bible, chapters 24 and 25, you know it is just a wall of red letters. If your Bible puts the words of Jesus in red letters, that is. It's just all Jesus talking. It's this gigantic discourse. Maybe you've cheated ahead and you know that it happens on the Mount of Olives and that it is therefore often referred to as the Olivet Discourse. And this is the trickiest of the 5 great speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured, because it deals with future things, how stuff is going to work out. Is there going to be some kind of justice or reckoning for all the screwed up stuff that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law have done, not just like last week, but for centuries at this point? Is any of that going to get addressed? What is the story of history going to look like? Jesus keeps saying he's going to die. So if he dies, how does it play out? There's a lot of questions lingering, and the disciples are going to ask two questions themselves that get us into this big, long speech from Jesus. And before we even start to unwrap that present, I just wanted to take our 10-ish minutes today to talk about what happens when people look at this passage. The same way that people read a ton of their different reads on planet Earth and how things ought to be into that simple little Ava Max song that I don't think is very complicated at all. So people historically have read in their complicated end times theories and theologies to this Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapters 24 and 25. And I don't think Jesus' words perfectly neatly fit with any of that. It doesn't seem like that's the precise concern that Jesus has in view here. And if we set aside all the noise and all the articles and people are upset and barking about this thing or that thing, and we just do what you and I have tried to do with this whole process going through the book of Matthew, which is just read the thing and try to look at the context and think about it for what it is on the page without the noise. If we do that here, I think it takes what many would consider to be two of the most complicated chapters in all of the Gospels, and it makes them actually pretty understandable for a normal person, even on their first pass. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't more layers to go and unpack about the theology of the end of time and how things work out. It's complicated, and there's plenty to look at there. There's a whole book dedicated to it at the end, and so maybe we'll get to all of that stuff later on. But for now, what we're going to do over the next, no promises, this is going to be a while, the next however long it takes us to get through chapters 24 and 25, this Olivet Discourse, is we're going to try and first and foremost stick to what is being said on the page and not inflict all of these other pressures on the text. So we can just kind of hear this thing in the moment and in the flow of thought that Jesus is developing, that the narrative is naturally taking us along on, and that Matthew is developing. Remember, chronologically, there's no reason to believe that Matthew is sitting here with a copy of Revelation in front of him, trying to square this thing up and make it work with what John writes there. Matthew probably super predates Revelations, or at least that's the assumption that you and I have been operating on from the beginning of this, if indeed it is written by Matthew. That comes way before John wrote that final book of the New Testament. No, instead, it looks like there are two simple questions that get asked by the disciples, and then Jesus goes about answering those questions. So here's a little preview of what we're going to be getting into the next few days. Matthew 24, verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, so a little bit of a walk passes here. We'll talk about that more as we get into this text in detail. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So there's your two questions. They're looking at how cool the temple is. And Jesus is like, speaking of the temple, not one stone here is going to be left on top of another. Every single one is going to be thrown down. This was the most incredible building ever. Again, we'll get into more of that in detail in the coming days, but that would have been unfathomable for them. This thing is permanent. It's immovable. It just got finished. It's expensive. It represents the strength of Israel. That's where God lives, theoretically. That can't happen. But Jesus is saying it is going to happen, and the destruction is going to be absolute. Now, we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that in 70 AD, exactly that happened. Titus and Vespasian, through multiple campaigns, saw to that. More on that to come in future conversations as well. And so Jesus is absolutely vindicated, and he's vindicated really in the grand scheme of history pretty quickly for this prediction. But then the disciples, they go on a walk for several hundred yards. Everybody's real quiet, and they get over to kind of up above where they're looking back down on the building that they were just in awe over and that Jesus said was going to get toppled. And finally somebody musters the courage to be like just real quiet now that nobody's around to really hear it, because I think you can get killed for even suggesting that would happen. Can you just maybe bring us up to speed on when the temple is going to be toppled? And also, when you're explaining that, could you explain how that relates to the signs of your coming? Because you're indicating that you're coming like in glory and you're going to win this thing. When does the temple get knocked down? And how's the timeline going to work? How are we going to know where we're at on that timeline? Those are the two questions that they're asking. And if we understand Matthew 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse, not through the lenses of centuries of theological debate, but through the lenses of the actual lyrics of the song, the actual cultural text that is in front of us, if we understand it as a response to those two questions, it just hums right along. And I think it makes quite a bit of sense. And the big picture thrust of all of this is this theme of preparedness, of being ready. It seems like the take home here is there is an end game to all of this. It is going to unfold. Here are a few highlights that you might be able to catch along the way, but ultimately your responsibility is to live ready for this grand unfolding of history, for the return of the Christ, of the Messiah, after he's killed and raised back to life. So in light of that, some people are going to look at the coming Olivet Discourse as we discuss it. We're going to be like, it's maddeningly inspecific. It's not enough stuff. My charts and my yarn and my red thumbtacks and my basement lighting need more information. And other people, I think, are going to look at this and they're going to be content to just be like, he got asked a question. He answered the question and he kind of went above and beyond and was like, so there's your answer to the question. And in light of that, here's the posture to assume in this coming period of time. Simply put, he answers the question, and then he's saying everything you need to live ready and function right in anticipation of the return of the Christ, you now have or you will have over the course of your lifetime. Now, all of that stuff needs caveating and a closer look. And we got the word study that Aaron Utek did when he was sitting in for me last week. We're going to get to all of that stuff, so much stuff. But all I wanted to do today was just set expectations for what we're going to get as we go through this thing. We are not going to solve every question Christians have ever debated over the next 2 chapters of coverage regarding the end times and how everything works out and the rapture and the millennium and all of that stuff. It might come up here and there, but we're not going to solve it. What we are going to do is see how this particular pair of chapters follows roughly that outline that I was just throwing out to you, and dig deep into how the original audience would have thought about this and into the question of why is this in the Bible? In the same way that the relatively simple and clear, if not very, very trite meaning of a pop song can be obscured by a few trigger words here and there that make people from all different political camps inflict all of their different persuasions and issues they're fighting that are completely external to one little pop song. In the same way, it can cloud that all up and make it terribly confusing to just simply interpret what is simply interpretable. So that can happen with certain hot button passages in the Bible that get into very pivotal theologies that people bring from the outside to a given text. But here, our goal is going to be what it's been all along working through the book of Matthew, and that is try to understand the words on this page and in this document to get what Jesus is saying and what Matthew is doing with what he's relaying here. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.